Hi, everyone, and welcome to Alpine Intel's The Savvy Adjuster podcast, where we discuss the property loss topics important to adjusters with the experts who know them best. I'm your host, Senior Account Manager Chris Nichols. Now, if you're new to Alpine Intel, welcome. We are a single source for property assessments and innovation through our operating brands, which are HVACI, Strike Check, National Fire Experts, Donan Engineering, Component Testing Laboratories, and of course, VRC Investigations. Our expert teams obviously provide high quality solutions to a variety of property loss questions. And today I am thrilled to be welcoming Donan Principal Forensic Engineer Rich Grimshaw and Senior Project Engineer Alec Hugdahl to the podcast to talk about a pretty big topic in property claims, which is water damage to structural elements. Gentlemen, welcome to the both of you.
Thanks, Chris.
Good afternoon.
So before we dive in, just a quick disclaimer. Each claim is obviously unique, and adjusters and experts really should consider a variety of factors when reaching their respective conclusions. So on this podcast, we really talk in general investigation and insurance terms and really for informational purposes only. Obviously, it's very important to get an assessment to make sure you have all the facts you need for your individual claims. But guys, before we dive into our topic today, I would absolutely love to just hear a little bit more about both of your backgrounds. And we can start with you, Rich. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about your background, not only with Donan, but just engineering in general?
Well, I started engineering a long time ago. I went into engineering school with a slide rule, if that tells you anything. And I've done design work on power plants and warehouses and various things like that. I worked with computer-aided design when it was in its infancy in the late 70s, early 80s, and even did a little work for the computer-aided design companies for a while. And eventually I found myself as a general contractor in the Atlanta, Georgia area, north of Atlanta, and partnered with a friend of mine here in Forsyth County, and we started building houses and various things. And we found lots of ways to lose money in contracting. It was an exciting time. And about 2008 or so, it became a bad time to be a home builder. You could build all you want, but you couldn't sell anything. So I went back to engineering, and I interviewed with Donan, and they took me on in 2009, and I have been here ever since.
Well, it sounds like we are in good hands today. And Alex, same question to you. I'd love to find out, and our listeners would love to find out just a little bit more about your background. Obviously, again, not only with Donan, but maybe prior to joining the team here.
Well, I graduated from the University of Florida in 1998, and I began working for a small engineering company in Tallahassee, where they did kind of 50-50 eminent domain work and forensic engineering work. It ended up moving towards a majority forensic engineering work, and I did that for 20 years. A lot of the same work we do at Donan. And then around 2019, early 2019, following when Hurricane Michael hit in October of 18, Donan was looking for an engineer in the panhandle of Florida to assist with all the claims on the Gulf Coast. And it just so happens I was looking to move on to a different direction from my prior job. Although I guess technically it ended up being in the same industry, and it just worked out. I started working for Donan, and I've been with them ever since.
Awesome. Well, again, I'm really thrilled to have the both of you here and really interested to dive into this topic with two experts like the both of you. And let's start off with a little introduction of how water can damage structures. We'll keep it kind of high level and then really drill down later in the episode. But Rich, if you don't mind, let's start with you. What are some water sources that might show up in a claim?
Oh, there are many. I've come to appreciate the problems and the power of water. It's got to be the most destructive thing there is out there when you take a look at it. If it rains too hard, you end up with water flowing down the street or flowing down a ravine. And it's got a lot of mass, so it has a lot of force, and it can cause flooding or flow damage. If it just rains gently for a long period of time, your ground can get saturated, and then you have foundation problems. And if your roof is leaking, it's going to get in the roof and maybe the leak doesn't show up for years, but all the while it hasn't been showing up. It's been rotting out your rafters and your roof sheathing, causing problems, and you've never noticed it for the whole time. Or maybe it's getting in a small crevice or a hole in a foundation and getting into a basement where you don't go, and now you've got a lot of water damage. And then it becomes water vapor, and that it helps the mold grow, and now you have mold, and maybe you have respiratory problems. So it's just hard to say all of them. But water is a suspect in a lot of the claims that we handle. And I didn't even get into the plumbing leaks, which are the obvious ones.
Yeah, we'll dive into obviously a little bit later the outside water sources plus the ones that are directly inside of your home, which I think a lot of people forget about as well. Alec, anything to add as far as water sources you've seen in past inspections that have shown up on claims you've worked?
I mean, Rich covered most of it. I would add there's also your, exterior elevations, walls of a house. You can get deficiencies in the cladding, deficiencies in flashings around windows and doors. All these things can lead to water intrusion in the house, which, as Rich said, they can go undetected for a long period of time, especially if they're low volume. Obviously, you'll get high volume ones that are inspected or that are discovered early on. And typically those don't cause as much structural damage because they notice it right away and typically can get it hopefully taken care of.
A good example of that, Alec, is EFIS, the synthetic stucco product, right? That was very popular in the 90s into the early 2000s. The water gets in and you don't know about it. And if the sheathing behind it isn't properly prepared, it gets saturated and it falls apart. And now you have the whole front of your house that needs to get torn off and replaced because of something that you never suspected was going on for the last 8 years. It's a real problem.
Yeah, I typically throughout my day think of larger losses like lightning and wind and a tree falling on something, but water seems to be not the silent killer, but can really kind of sneak in and catch you if you don't catch it right away. So obviously a big topic we're talking about. Alec, we'll start with you for this next question. Since it is a big topic, can we talk a little bit about what might make certain structural components vulnerable to water in your experience?
Well, I would say when there's inadequate flashing, you can get low volume leaks that'll penetrate like structural members, whether it be roof members or wall members, especially around like windows and doors. You get those where they're leaking for years. And then what'll happen is a homeowner won't realize it until all of a sudden, sometimes it's not even, they don't even notice the actual water damage itself or like staining or fungal growth. They'll actually notice cracks in their house that are resulting from the structural movement due to that long-term damage. And obviously ground slopes, there's lots of issues that can result in water coming in the house. Was there anything specific that you?
No, just kind of curious, and I know that talking prior to this episode with the both of you, you've both got kind of different experiences and inspections you've done and different materials you've worked with in the past. So I was just kind of curious, to speak to how structural components can be vulnerable to water damage. And Rich, piggybacking off of Alec's answer, with your experience in the field and doing inspections, anything to add to that as far as what might make a certain structural component vulnerable to water damage like we're talking about today?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that we've talked about water intrusion, which kind of infers that the water is outside and it's coming inside. But water that starts off inside of the structure can cause an awful lot of damage. Just living in a house while you're cooking, doing laundry, in the bathrooms, running water like that, you generate a lot of moisture in the air. And if the building isn't put together right, or we have other environmental issues, the water that's inside already can do a lot of damage too. So I want to make sure that we focus on that. And then to add to that, those kinds of problems, which I'm going to lump under the general heading of indoor air quality. And when I say indoor air quality, I mean generally too much moisture in the air. The humidity is too high. There's no way to get out. The problems that creates changes depending upon the climate that you're in. Now, Alec is down in the panhandle of Florida. very hot, very humid weather. And so structures need to be put together a certain way there in order to manage that flow of moisture in and out of the house. I'm in Atlanta area, which is very similar. In fact, it's so similar as to not be able to be differentiated for the most part. But if you go up to the Northeast into the states of New York and Connecticut and so forth, they have a different climate. Canada has a different climate. The Pacific Northwest has a different climate, and the buildings have to be insulated, and the water planes have to be developed on the outside to manage that flow of air and moisture in and out of the house in order to keep problems from happening. Because if you don't get that, then that's when you get the very silent power of water doing damage silently over a long period of time. Tiny houses are a big thing these days. I don't know if you've heard of those very much, but I was just listening to a fellow the other day saying that one of the biggest problems they have in a tiny home is managing the moisture, because there's very little space and there's a lot of moisture. And if the building envelope isn't done right, you're going to have problems. Well, multiply that by a larger house and you can get there. Bigger house and you have the same amount of moisture coming out, you have a lower impact of moisture in the air, but still, if it's not managed, you can have a problem. So you got the moisture on the inside of the house. Outside, I've seen water come up through the slab in a basement. Unfortunately, it was a house that I built and I had to fix it, so that wasn't great, but it was a lesson learned. Groundwater is a very powerful thing, and if you don't account for it when you're building something, then you have to account for it afterward. Alec was right. If you don't have the flashings around your windows and doors, and the siding isn't detailed correctly, you're going to have problems with that. We mentioned stucco. That's also an issue. If the roof isn't put on right, or if it's a very, what they say in the business is a cut up roof, one that has a lot of different planes that come together at various angles. And if the valley and flashing isn't done right, if you have a lot of dead valleys up there, then you're going to have problems with that. And if you don't take care of that when you build it, you're going to have to take care of it later. Water is always a concern, always. And people just need to be aware of that.
Well, it sounds like it not only comes from naturally, right, from rain, from hurricanes, but it can be manufactured defects, things like that can really cause a lot of these issues. I was thinking and kind of counting my lucky stars that I haven't really had too much water damage in the places that I've lived. But then you think long enough and you remember I did have an apartment. It was the first house that I bought, and I had a very, very slow drip coming out of the pipe under the sink that I was never under. I never stored anything. And after about 2.5 years, that slow drip had rotted away the flooring, got into the wall. And so perfect example of something I didn't even know about that was happening, just a very slow drip, and say it was one drip a day, right? Got into that and caused that damage. So yeah, very silent. And yes, I have heard of tiny homes, but I am 6'4" tall. So that has never, ever been an option for me. But yes, I'm jealous of the people that can get away with them. Rich, we'll go back to you. So we've been talking about external and internal water sources, but the way that you approach an inspection, and we've been talking about internal water sources like plumbing, HVAC systems, things like that. Is the inspection process any different for an external water source versus something that's, say, inside of the house?
Well, yes and no. I think the process is always the same. You're trying to be attentive to what you see, and you're trying to take what you have been told by whoever is concerned about it, and you're thinking all the time, what could be wrong here? Now, from experience and training, you have a list in your head of what could possibly be wrong, and so you start looking. You always want to look at plumbing, even if it's a remote possibility. You have to look at it, right? So if you have water in a crawl space and you're wondering why the water is there, you're going to look at any plumbing that is exposed and make sure there is or is not a leak. You have to do that. But the same thing goes for if you're looking for water in the ceiling of a house on its second floor. It's not a crawl space, you're on the second floor, but you're still going to make sure there's no plumbing up there. Now, I know people are going to say, Rich, who's going to put plumbing in their attic? Well, if you live in Texas, you'll have plumbing in your attic, okay? So you always have to look for things that are obvious that might be covered. Plumbing is one of them. Now, if you suspect groundwater getting into a house, a basement, or even the siding where the grade is too high in the back of a house. You're certainly going to still look for plumbing, but you're also going to study very hard that side of the house where you think the water is getting in. And so the process is the same. You're developing hypotheses of what it could be, and you're checking them out, finding evidence that supports it or does not support it. But what you look at changes based upon the nature of the problem. And let me just say that that's one of the most important things in any project is to first define the problem. What is it, Mr. Client, that you really want me to find out for you? You know, what subjects do I need to cover so that you can adequately adjust this claim? And many of our clients, they have a certain view of what they're looking at, and so they'll give us a scope of work, and we look at that and we will ask probing questions, trying to broaden that and make sure that we really are asking what they need to know. I mean, that's part of our effort to help our client do better for their clients.
Yeah, I think Donan does a great job of making those follow-up calls with either the insured or with the adjuster on file to get that scope of work. So again, we don't need to go back out. You know, we can get it on the first time because a lot of these claims are time sensitive, right? And they need the report back quickly to help move that claim through its life cycle. So, Alec, anything to add as far as the inspection process of what you've seen personally with indoor inspections for water sources that are coming internally versus externally? Any differences between the two and how you approach those?
No, I mean, I tend to try to treat every claim similarly. I show up, I find out what the problem is from the homeowner or business owner. Um, I I go and determine whether the problem is also local or global, because sometimes it'll be a widespread issue in the home, sometimes it'll be local. If it's local, I try to look around and see, like Rich said, are there nearby plumbing systems? Perhaps the HVAC system is, as he was talking about, running plumbing through an attic, which isn't as common, but oftentimes what is very common is there's an HVAC system in the attic. And so you have ductwork that has air conditioned air going through it. And if it's not insulated correctly, it can get condensation. It also has a condensate line, typically in the attic, if there are air handlers in the attic. And so that's another potential source. So what you're trying to do is find all the potential sources that could be contributing to that moisture above, below, and surrounding the area.
It sounds like putting a very intricate jigsaw puzzle together that's sometimes. So similar with fire investigations, you're gathering all the information you need and kind of putting an overall picture together for your client. So
And experience helps too, Chris, because if you have done this for 10 years, you will have a longer list of possibilities than if you have been doing it for 10 months. All right. And so that's one the one good thing about being an old engineer is I have a lot of experience. Okay. And as the saying goes, never underestimate an old man with an engineering degree.
I don't think I've ever heard that, but I am probably going to steal that for future conversations with my customers. And to your point, experience and being around forever, Donan 80 plus years as a company, right? So they've got that knowledge base to get you very accurate reports. So
let me riff on that for just a minute,
sure.
because one of the things that is very strong in Donan is our culture of sharing amongst the professionals. It is common, an everyday occurrence when an engineer asks his peers, I'm looking at something and I'd like to know if anyone else has seen it. And that person will immediately get help from 4 or 5 coworkers whose own experience goes beyond that of that one person.
It's great to hear. And again, they are in good hands with us here. So, Alec, we'll move back to you for the next question. And just kind of curious, outside of the cause of loss and the source of water, which obviously are very important to determine, what are some other things adjusters should consider before they settle a structural claim involving water damage? Not to put words in your mouth, but maybe looking at the age of the water damage, the extent of the loss, but anything that an adjuster should consider prior to moving a claim forward with water damage?
Yeah, I would say they typically have three concerns. They want to know the cause of the water damage. They want to know the extent of the damage, like interior components, whether it's finishes or structural components or whatever that may be. And then obviously the duration. And depending upon your insurance policy, what state you're in, duration is probably one of the more important things of water damage, because they want to know whether or not this was a short term. And in short term, it can be relative, speaking from one client to another. One client may consider short term to be weeks. One client may consider short term to be months. So they wanted you to be as specific as possible with the duration of the water damage. And we can establish that based on the discoloration of the damage, the extent of section loss or structural degradation as a result of the exposure. Depending on what material it is, different materials will degrade in different rates. You have to take all that into account and basically provide them with that information so they can best apply it to their policy and determine whether or not, the coverage of the claim.
Sure. And Rich, anything to add to Alex's answer as far as things adjusters, maybe a checklist, not so much a checklist per se, but just stuff they should have in the back of their mind before settling a structural claim involving water damage?
The only thing I would add to what Alex said is that uh, uh, there's going to be some kind of repair involved, I'm sure, with this kind of a loss. And so we need to be able to provide some advice on what kind of repair is appropriate. If we're talking about wood and water damage, it almost always involves wood rot or decay, where the properties of the wood are so depleted that it just can't do what it's supposed to anymore. So that has to be replaced. And sometimes that means you replace a 2x4 that's long, and sometimes it means you replace a whole roof. That is one of the important things, is to know the extent of damage and what kind of repair you're looking at. Beyond that, I wouldn't have anything to add.
Sure. Uh, well, follow-up question, and this is really for both of you here, but what kind of evidence may indicate that damage is older than maybe the claim states? They're stating the date of loss is July 7th, but it looks way older than that. Rich, we'll go with you first, but any sort of evidence that might indicate that damage is much older than maybe the claim is stating?
Well, Alec kind of addressed that when he said you can look at the coloration of the wood, and there's technical studies on that to back it up. If you take wood and subject it to inundation in water, repeated wet, dry, there's a certain amount of days it's going to turn black. Other than that, it's not going to turn black. And there was some other wood that was involved in the study. Alec, help me out. Did they do press board in there, or what am I trying to think of?
I think it was the particle board.
Particle board.
I know they do particle board cabinets.
Yeah. And, you could tell by the degree of degradation of the cabinet, how long well, I shouldn't say how long, but let's say the minimum amount of time that it was there. If it's completely degraded, the study said it would be at least 120 days, so more than 120 days. And if it wasn't completely degraded, it would be less than 120 days. These are very qualitative assessments, but they're the best that we've got, and at least we do have something to make that judgment by. I think into complete deterioration of wood, now that's another thing that can be kind of subjective. If you take wood that's exposed to water, dry, wet, dry conditions down in Tallahassee, it's not going to take long for that wood to rot. North of Atlanta, it might take a little bit longer. Upstate New York, a little bit longer. It's environmental, but those are the kinds of things you can look at.
Hey, Alec, you were going to add something earlier?
Yes, a lot of that testing that Rich was discussing earlier, a lot of it is like how the length of time the material was exposed to moisture. But a lot of times what we're dealing with is it's an intermittent moisture exposure. So while it may be months of moisture exposure that resulted in that, the time that it actually took to reach that extent could have been significantly longer, because you're talking about occasional wettings, not a continuous wetting of the component. So there's lots of various various data that we're gathering that helps us do that. And as Rich was talking about the particle board cabinets, I think what they measure is the amount of deflection those cabinets get. And based on the amount of deflection, you know it's been exposed for X amount of time. Same thing with OSB. OSB obviously degrades much quicker than like a plywood or a solid wood board. It just, you have to know your various components and how they react to the moisture.
Sure. I learned something. I learned many new things through this podcast recording and doing the podcast, but it's very interesting to learn about, rate of decay for certain materials, things like that, and also the regionality of things. Right? I live in Milwaukee, and you can guess it's a little different than Florida or than Atlanta, and so we have different conditions up here that you may not. And being able to have an engineer and a professional that's got the experience to say, hey, this is located in the Midwest versus the Southeast versus the Northeast. It sounds like that's a pretty important thing to factor in as well. So.
Prime example of that is ice dams. You have to worry about ice dams in your climate. I don't worry about ice dams in Georgia. I worry about kudzu. We can go on and on about kudzu, but you take your ice dams, I got my kudzu. And, and it's entirely different in California. So it is very much a location-based situation.
Yeah, definitely more snow up here, less alligators. So I will take the snow, I think. So, well, you guys have given us a ton of really valuable information, obviously, on water sources, how you approach your investigations that are doing. But I always like to, at the tail end of the episode, kind of dive into real life examples, right? It's always interesting to hear, with your vast inspection experience, some real life water damage examples. And so if you have some, great. But Rich, we can start with you. Any come to mind either recently or in your years of experience that our listeners may find interesting?
I have a lot. I'm trying to sort them out and find a good one to talk about. So there was one recently. In fact, there were two recently that come to mind. One had to do with water intrusion into a basement. Now, the basement was fully finished, and in fact, we had members of the family living there full time, and they'd been there for a very long time. I believe 30 years, maybe 30 plus years. Recently, Hurricane Helene came through the Georgia area and dumped a lot of rain. The Atlanta, Georgia area had 10, 12, 14 inches of rain in some spots. This was in an area where there was upwards of 11 inches of rain. And after the rain had passed, after the third day of rain had passed, and we had 11 inches of rain, it was that evening that they noticed that the carpet was wet. They got up in the middle of the night, the carpet was wet, and soon the carpet in the entire downstairs was wet. So water was coming somewhere, and they had to get all the water out of that basement. And they did not have the benefit of a remediation company, so they did it with a 16-gallon shop vac, and they emptied it, I don't know, 30 times or so. And the question is, where is this water coming from? Now, they have lived in this house for a long time, and it's never happened before, and it happened now. And why did that happen? That's a tough question. So you have to know where the water came from and where it's going. You have to understand a little bit about how houses are constructed here in Georgia, where it is, and in order to make a determination. So we were pretty sure we knew where the water was coming from based upon the occupants' testimony about where it started and where it progressed to. So we knew it was from, and we could see the outside of that part of the building pretty well. The inside was covered with wall finishes, so we couldn't see much, but we cut some holes and were able to look at some of the structure in there. And the other thing that was important is that side of the house, now this is a basement that comes to daylight. It's a walkout basement or a daylight basement. People call it different things. But that kind of a house should have a perimeter drain around the entire foundation, so that any water that comes down the foundation wall to the footing would flow into the drain and flow out to daylight. Well, we could not find that drain on that side of the house. it was either not there or it was clogged and buried. So any water that got down there could not come out the drain, and it had to go somewhere, and it's not going to go up, so it's going to go inside. And my determination was that it did go inside. Information that helped that determination was the holes that we cut in the drywall in that corner, and we could see that there was evidence of long-term water there. And in fact, one of the wooden studs for the finished wall there had some serious wood decay. And that's only going to happen if it has repeated long-term exposure to moisture. So to say that this had never occurred before, it's not quite correct. It had occurred before, but on a much briefer, smaller scale, and certainly not enough to get the entire basement wet. So in my opinion, it was groundwater that was coming in and had done so many times, and they needed to take a look at the drain and maybe the waterproofing, damp proofing of the foundation. So that's the most exciting one, recent memory.
It's exciting to me. That's very interesting. And again, I find it so interesting. Before talking to the both of you, I just assumed water claims came from big events, right? A ton of rain, flooding, things like that. But learning it's not always the case, and it can happen with a slow burn, if you will. So similar to my sink example I shared earlier. So really interesting on that. Alec, anything over your years of experience that kind of would be interesting for our listeners to hear about as far as inspections you've done with water damage?
Well, I would hope they find it interesting. My wife tends to find all my work incredibly boring. But, I deal with a lot of crawl space moisture. I would say between the most common leaks I deal with are actually roof leaks and crawl spaces. I do get the occasional plumbing leaks, but those are the majority. Well, a common thing I get is I'll go out to a home and these people have lived in their home for 20 years. And then all of a sudden they've noticed that they're built over crawl space. All of a sudden they've noticed that their floors have localized sagged areas or buckled subfloor beneath the floor covering. So in the process of my inspection, you're asking them, when did you notice this? How long has it been going on? And then you also have to ask them, have you made any changes to the air conditioning system? Because a lot of times that will affect the cooling of the house and drying of the house. And then have you made any changes to the floor coverings? And what will happen is a lot of times you'll find that they've installed the vinyl floor planks, which is a very, trendy thing to cover your floors. They look really nice. They look just like floors. But what they act like is a vapor barrier, and it traps the moisture in a crawl space. And down here in the South, all crawl spaces, unless they're dehumidified, typically will have some sort of elevated moisture. And when they install that vinyl floor planks down, it acts as a vapor barrier. It traps that moisture beneath the vinyl floor planks, which results in deterioration and or swelling of the subfloor. And all of a sudden, they start getting these deficiencies in their floors that truthfully only recently occurred, but it was because of a recent change to the house itself. So that's a common thing I come across. It's not a specific example, but I see it so much. I just thought I'd share.
Yeah, but it's good because, when you're working with a professional engineering firm like Donan, you are trained to ask those questions and dig a little bit deeper instead of just kind of using your eyes, asking questions of the homeowner. Any changes happen, and that sometimes leads you, or in this case, did lead you to an explanation of the damage. So no, I agree with you on the wife finding things interesting. If she ever has trouble sleeping, my wife, I just start talking about my day, and it typically does the trick.
Stop. Well, Alec was on another point there that was really interesting, and that is that if the air conditioning system is changed, that can also be a problem. So, Alec, I'm guessing a lot like the ones I've looked at. If people change out their air conditioner, it's not uncommon for them to increase its size, go from a 2.5 ton to a 3 ton, right? Because it just wasn't cold enough. That can be a problem. It's if your air conditioner is too big, it will cool your air very quickly. And that's not good. You want it to cool the air more slowly, because as it's cooling, the whole time it's cooling, it's also taking moisture out of the air. So if instead of running for 30 minutes at a time, it now runs 10 minutes at a time, it's not drawing nearly enough moisture out of the air. And that's commonly called short cycling. And that means you end up with a higher relative humidity inside the house than it was before. And that change in conditions can cause lots of different things. One of the more common is mold growth, fungal growth, because of the higher relative humidity, especially if they tend to keep the house dark inside during the day if they're out working or whatever, and a host of other problems. So it's always a good thing to ask about that. Related to that, in older homes, it's not uncommon in Georgia for them to be heated by space heaters, ventless gas room heaters, which were common a long time ago. And for an older person living in one of those houses to have the house heated that way, they want to keep it hot, which means when the gas is burned, it throws off water vapor. You have a high water vapor inside the house, and it can damage a lot of things. Grow mold. I've seen it damage the drywall on the ceiling so bad that it falls off the ceiling. So that's another source of moisture not commonly thought of.
That led to another question that I didn't ask previously, prior to the real world examples, but the age of the house, is that a factor typically in inspections? I live in a house that was built in 1924, right? So it's a little bit different from, a 1980s home. But can you speak a little bit, either of you, as far as the factoring the age of the home in your inspections?
Alec, I don't know about you, but for me, the age of the home has more to do with the methods of construction when it was built. So a house built in the 20s will have been built differently than a house built in the 80s or a house built today. And if you are aware of those things, it can give you some insight as to what might be going on, whether it's a water claim or any kind of claim. So yes, it does make a difference. And then how well the house is maintained is also, that makes a difference. And it's hard to generalize, Chris. You just, have to go with what you got.
Sure. Just a curiosity question. Different building materials used back in the 20s versus the 90s, things like that. Alec, you were going to mention something?
Well, to go with the different construction methods, older houses could have differently ventilated attic spaces. Similar, the crawl spaces could be differently ventilated. Back when they were built, the requirements for the ventilation of those areas were different. Also, on older homes, your windows may be not as airtight as the current windows are now, and all that will affect how a home essentially breathes and retains or dries out, holds moisture.
Yeah, I can speak to the lack of quality of some of my windows in my house. They certainly do let those winter winds in. Probably should look at that. But well, hey, thank you so much to the both of you for joining us for this episode of the Savvy Adjuster podcast and sharing your insight about water damage to structural elements. Really appreciate it. A lot of good stuff. And obviously, thanks again to everyone who is listening. If you want to find additional resources for addressing water damage on the in your claims, you can go to our website. We have a resource page at alpineintel.com. Ton of great information up there, as well as materials about a variety of other property loss topics, not just water damage. And if you aren't already subscribed, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. You'll never miss an episode. And really, finally, it goes without saying, but if you do have any sort of property claims that need assessments, you can always submit an assignment on our website. I mentioned it earlier, but it bears repeating, alpineintel.com, or you can simply go there to get more details about how our suite of services can bring you the answers you need to feel confident about your settlement decisions. But thanks again to the both of you. Thanks to the listener, and we will see you next time.